the beginning of June 2011, people from many countries came to Lviv Lychakiv Memorial Cemetery. They arrived from Italy, Armenia, Russia, and from different regions of Ukraine. Yet most of the pilgrims were from Poland. Among them, there were Minister of National Minorities of Poland, Polish senators, and many clergymen of the Polish Catholic Church. All these people headed to the cemetery of Iglets, a part of Lychakiv cemetery where Polish fighters for their native town are buried. In the Soviet times, authorities were trying to suppress memories about them, as well as memories about Polish history of Lviv. Communist authorities did their best to eradicate memories not only about prominent Poles, but also about entire pre-Soviet life in Galicia. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It was in 1951 that secretly, at night, a group of Catholic believers found their way to the cemetery and opened the crypt with the body of the righteous man. The coffin was taken to another family crypt to rest in peace. Next day, the KGB officers came to destroy the tomb of this man, but found that his crypt was void. It took more than 70 years for the body of this man to rest in peace in its initial place. All these people gathered together here to manifest their respect to him and to commemorate him. That man was a patriot of Poland. He was a Polish senator and a member of the Galician Sejm. He was the last Lviv Armenian Catholic Archbishop and the Metropolitan of Poland. That man was an Armenian by origin. His name was Joseph Theophilos Theodorovich. The reburial of the Armenian Archbishop of Poland is just a minor point in a long and old story which we would like to narrate. This is a story of long-lasting and forced exodus of the Armenians from their native lands in Transcaucasia and Minor Asia. This is a story about a myriad of Armenian communities dwelling in the Eastern and Western Europe in the Middle Ages. This is the story about the nation which benefited Europeans with spiritual and cultural heritage of tremendous value. This is a story of the Armenian heritage in Europe. Crimea is a legendary peninsula. Due to its unique location, mild climate, and various landscapes, it is considered to be one of the blessed places on Earth. Some historians trace Armenians' arrival to Crimea around 6th–7th centuries. Yet recent findings make it possible to date the arrival even to much earlier times. One of the major migration waves of the Armenians to Crimea was in the middle of the 11th century, when ancient capital of Ani fell down. As political and economic conditions were improving, more migrants were settling down here. When Ani fell down in 1045, and after the earthquake in Ani, the population of Ani left the city and started to look around for a new place to inhabit. During the 12th and 14th centuries, Armenian colonies in Kaffa or Theodosia, Sudak and Solhat, which is the old Crimea, were so big that in European documents of that time we can find Latin names of Armenia Magna and Armenia Maritima. That means Great Armenia and Maritime Armenia. In the 13th and 14th century, there were so many Armenians in Crimea that Crimea itself sometimes was called Maritime Armenia. So just imagine, according to some data, there were 200 Armenian churches. In Theodosia alone, there were 47 churches. As hardships grew up in Armenia, more immigrants were moving to Crimea. In the 12th century, there were about 40 parishes of the Armenian Apostolic Christians. Armenians became the second biggest ethnic group in Crimea after the Turkish-speaking population. According to the census of 1470, Armenians made up two-thirds of Theodosia population. Merchants and craftsmen found here good markets, sea and land routes made their trade especially profitable. Due to their tolerance and hard work, Armenians were living in peace with their neighbors. Armenians who settled in Crimea immediately started to build churches and schools. The monastery schools, writers, painters were educated in monastery schools at Kaffa and Surpkhach. This is a high and shadowy forest, mountains and vacant land. What's this? Walls of building? Here it is the monastery. Well, where are the people? It's all silent around, only sound of water in white fountain under the arch. These verses, written by the Russian poet Maximilian Voloshin, are dedicated to the Armenian monastery Surpkhach, or the Holy Cross. It is the only one of 4 Armenian monasteries which survived in surroundings of Salkhat until present times. Many outstanding Armenians lived and worked in Surpkhach. Medieval frescoes are still on the walls of the altar and the gates. Miniatures from the manuscripts are being preserved in Matenadaran, the Yerevan Institute for Ancient Manuscripts. Church of the monastery was built in the 14th century. Later on Gavit, which is a church with belfry and monk cells, were built. It resembled more of a fortress than a monastery. Small windows looked like loopholes, and belfry was good enough to control the road. When enemies were approaching the monastery, it was turned into a fortress. Monastery nowadays is being reconstructed. Armenians and believers from different other religious groups can pray together in it. Presently, this monastery is one of the main centers for pilgrimage for the Armenian Church in Crimea and northern Black Sea area. In the late 20th century, due to Crimean Armenians and Armenian Apostolic Church, the monastery was renovated. Several years ago, monks settled here. It means that the tradition is being still preserved. So new Khachkars bless the ancient Crimean land. As a vicar in Crimea and an overseer of Surpkhach, I see it as my mission not only to preserve what we have received, but we have to pass it on to the future generations. Small Armenian town Kazarat was at the outskirts of the monastery until the end of the 15th century. Armenian princes kept their troops there to protect Kaffa, as it was agreed with Genoas according to the treaty. In Kaffa itself, there were Armenian schools, dozens of churches, banks, trade houses, hotels, craftsman shops. So the city was one of the major centers of Crimean Tatars. It was so important that in 1438, Armenians of Kaffa were invited to delegate their deputies to the Florence Ecumenical Council. In the 17th century, some 46,000 Armenians lived here. It was 70% of the population. In terms of our time, we could rightfully claim that it was a city with 1 million people, which has the largest city ever existing somewhere outside Armenia. Even in the beginning of the 20th century, there were 7 Armenian churches. Armenians made a quarter of the population here before the Second World War. Currently, in a few churches remaining after the collapse of the Soviet Union, services are conducted in Church Slavonic language. Churches belong to the Russian Orthodox Church. Although there are signs of Armenian culture everywhere, most believers have no idea that they visit the Armenian church. Saint Sarkis Church is on the Armenian street in Theodosia. It is one of the oldest functioning Armenian churches in Crimea. In Saint Sarkis Cathedral, in Middle Ages, there operated one of the major scriptoriums, the School for Miniature and Engraving. There is an inscription on the wall of this temple stating that the temple was rebuilt after the fire of 80. Ovanes Ivazovsky, who was a painter, also donated money for reconstruction, because the cathedral was destroyed during the fire. Surp Sarkis was important to him. He was baptized in it and was buried here. According to his will, he was buried on the territory of the temple. It is written in Armenian on marble plate. Born as a mortal human being, left immortal memories. Lives and destinies of the Crimean Armenians usually were taken as hostages to fighting and bargaining among the big players here. First, Genoas and Seljuks, Osmans, Tatars, and Russian Empire. Armenians were given self-government and privileges, or they were pushing them around. Next day they could be forced out of here, and that was done during the reign of Russian Queen Catherine II. In order to undermine the economy of Tatar Khanate, Catherine II decided to transfer people from here. So Armenians were deported 3 times. First time it happened in 1779, the second one after the Russian-Turkish War, and the third time after the Second World War. Our people know that the first nations to be deported were Tatars, Armenians, Greeks, Bulgarians, Goths. In 1946, there was the second deportation wave. So it was the so-called quiet Soviet deportation in 1946. Yes, the destiny of Armenians in exile was bitter and tragic. As a result of Turkish genocide in the beginning of the 20th century, a new wave of migration to Crimea took place. This time, people fled from the Western Armenia and other regions of Ottoman Empire. They arrived here looking for shelter and protection, counting on Armenians who were already living here for ages. As a rule, they have been starting their new settlements from building churches. Armenian church in Yalta is similar to the ancient church Rapsime in Echmiadzin. The Crimean Surp Rapsime was constructed and was funded by the Baku industrialist Ter Khukasov in 1914. And in 5 years, the church was closed by the atheists, and the atheists and KGB closed it. But even when it was functioning as a warehouse, the music and the words of the Armenian service was heard in it. There is a saying that God is testing those people whom He loves the most. And God really loves Armenians a lot. Turmoil in Armenia forced Armenian people to move all around Europe. In every European country we can find Armenian roots. our Armenian influence, Armenian heritage, because Armenians are the people who are coming to create. They are coming to become a part of a nation. Armenians go to new places to create things together with Ukrainians, Polish people, Romanians, and this is what other people appreciate much. Historians assume that Armenians lived in Galicia since the 10th century. King Danila Galitsky invited Armenians in the middle of the 13th century to take part in the foundation of a new city. The city was named after his son Leo. But even earlier, in the 9th and 10th centuries, Armenian warriors from Kaffa were invited to protect borders and to fight contenders. Armenian community in Lviv was one of the biggest in Ukraine. It was here in 1364 that the diocese center was founded for Armenians in Rus and Wallachia. Lviv was granted Magdeburg law in the middle of the 14th century. According to the law, national communities received local self-government. Armenian quota appeared to be in the center of the city of Lvov.
В цьому древньому княжому місті біля 700 років живе моя родина Абрахамовичів.
My Abrahamovich family lives in this ancient city for over 700 years. This is historical evidence that Armenians lived on the territory of Lvov prior to its origin in 1256. On this picture you can see a mountain from which Lviv started.
Тут було поселення вірмен. І якраз на цій картині є зображена
This mountain is called High Castle. It was the basis of this mountain that Armenians settled before the foundation of the Ukrainian city of Lvov.
Біля підніжжя цієї гори було перше поселення моїх предків вірмен, які проживали, як я сказав, ще на цих теренах до заснування міста Львова.
Armянskaya Street became a central part of the Armenian quarter. This name is mentioned for the first time in the documents around 1441. Armenian temple is mentioned on Armянskaya Street even 100 years earlier. Armenian diaspora consisted mostly of merchants. They were brave, courageous people providing linkage between the East and the West. Armenian merchants spoke many foreign languages. As gifted people, they combined merchandise with diplomacy. And they also knew a lot of Western languages. And I received this information from my father and my grandfather. And it was also the diplomacy which was linking East with West. Armenian printing house was working in Lviv since the 16th century. Ovanes Karmatenianits published here a prayer book in 1618. This is the only printed book in the world in Armenian Kipchak language, which used to be a writing language of the language of Armenians in Crimea and Ukraine. A huge amount of documents is still preserved in Lviv City Archive. So history of Galicia land was not easy at all. Armenian community went through common hardships. Under Polish kings Kazimierz the Great and Sigismund the Old, there were two more waves of the Armenian migration. It has a lot to do with the fall of the Kingdom of Kilikia in the end of the 14th century. New Armenian migrants arrived to Podolia, Volyn, Galicia.
Вони не були в якості.
So they were not the consumers of the wealth on the land which they started to populate. This was the essence of the Armenian diaspora for ages.
Очевидно, це був стержень, який
Armenians invested in the environment and community they lived in.
Шляхетний шлях, який передбачав.
They left prominent and quite obvious for us traces. The grandfather of academician Orest Abrahamovich Bogdan knew Armenian language and spoke it. There is a crypt of this old Armenian family living in Galicia for 7 centuries, on the Chakiv Cemetery in Lviv. There are many more Armenian crypts here. The only difficulty is to identify Armenian tombs under Polonized family names. Polish Senate member Lukasz Abgarovich appreciates the very fact of identification of the initial place of burial. So this is a big event for all Armenians all over the world and for all confessions. Generally speaking, Teodorovich is a very distinguished person for all the Polish people. Between the 2 world wars in Poland, national mourning was proclaimed only twice, after the death of Pilsudski, and this is a well-known fact, and after the death of Teodorovich. A big group of Armenian painters worked in Lviv. Pavel Bogushevich and his son Zhimon are one of the most gifted painters. Due to them and their students, we can see the faces of prominent Armenians of all times. Montpieu Bank was founded by the Armenian Brotherhood and was located near the cathedral. It was the only church bank that existed until 1939. The unique bank is that it was founded in the medieval times. Though there is a restaurant here, but the busts of bank directors are still decorating the corridors of the bank.
І вони добивалися такого успіху.
They were very successful. Leaders of the Armenian community were among the leaders of the cities.
Місто Львів.
Bogdan Zhimorovich became the mayor of Lviv, and we know that according to his will, he left all his huge amount of wealth for the city of Lviv, and this is the unprecedented fact. Armenians presented to the city of Lvov the historian Sadok Baronch, pharmacist and kerosene lamp inventor Ignat Lukashevich, well-known chemist in the 40s of the 19th century, the chemist and doctor Theodor Tarasevich. Tarasevich was the first to discover the healing powers of springs near Truskovets. Nowadays, we all know it as a well-known resort. It's not widely known that the outstanding pianist-composer, one of the founders of the Galician Music Society, Karol Mikuli, was also of an Armenian origin. Unfortunately, contemporary encyclopedias treat these people as the Poles, Hungarians, and Romanians, but all of them were always conscious of their Armenian origin. One of the astonishing phenomena about Armenians in Europe is in Vienna, on the Danube River. It's namely to Vienna that a big group of priests, Mkhitarists, moved after a Napoleonic victory, nearby Trieste on the beginning of the 19th century. Mkhitar, the founder of the order, escaped from Turks from Constantinople to Vienna and founded monastery on presented to him island San Lazzaro del Armeni. Main tasks of the activities of the order have always been the cultural development of the Armenian diaspora and preservation of the language. It is important for Europe that we, Armenians, are able not only to preserve culture, but to create it also. Typically, Armenian exhibits are khachkars, and also the typical Armenian manuscripts, miniatures, and folk music. There are many samples which have to do with the Armenian religious rituals. This collection is more than 200 years old.
So die Geschichte, dass wir hierher fast jetzt heuer 1811 bis 2011 200 Jahre, dass wir hier in Österreich sind.
In Mchitaris monastery, there are not only big collections of ancient manuscripts, but also a collection of more than 150-year-old Armenian carpets.
Im Allgemeinen ein Pater, Mechitaristenpater.
Mechitaris priest is the first and foremost a spiritual leader, a keeper of old culture. He is a collection, a keeper, and a protector. These are three aspects, very important aspects for tradition, for upcoming generations. All Armenian antiquities that are found in Armenia, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, and the US, they are all sent here to Vienna. So the first is in San Lazzaro, the second is here. We collect cultural values for over 200 years.
Haben die hier nach Wien geschickt, Mutterhaus, ja, zweites Mutterhaus. San Lazzaro, Italien, das eine, hier das zweite, hierher geschickt worden ist es, innerhalb von 200 Jahren.
Armenians contributed not only to spiritual life, but also to the material culture of Vienna. Tradition to drink Viennese coffee started after Armenians fled from Turkey to Vienna. Armenians opened the first Vienna Café.
Ist eine Recherche, dass jeder kommt auf dasselbe Ergebnis, dass zwei wichtige Personen und beide
According to one of the research works, first cafe in Vienna was opened by two persons, and both Armenians. The first was Deodatus Atvasatur, coming from Poland, the second one Georg Kulczycki. Since then, first cafe was organized and kept by Armenians.
Waren sesshaft hier in Österreich. Von damaliger Zeit schon.
There is an inscription on Rote Turmstraße with explanations about this fact.
Von Armenien. Und gibt es Beweise? Gibt es zum Beispiel im ersten Bezirk, Rote Turmstraße, dort, wo es gezeigt wird und da erklärt wird, erste Kaffeehaus, Wiener Kaffeehaus, eingeführt von Theodatus.
The founders of the Vienna cafes were born in Podolia, a part of the Polish kingdom. According to some sources, Armenians were settled in Kamenets-Podolsky in the second half of the 11th century. I think that the southern rocky slopes of the island looked very much like their native Armenia. I myself live in Armenian quarters where we grow grapes. They stick to the stones and climb up just as the Armenians, and take roots once again an ancient Ani people, for whom Kamenets became the second homeland.
И по своему рельефу, по своему этому, то есть это очень много, когда бывают гости, говорит, это смотрит, говорит, это и каждый.
Both in its landscape and in other details, it looks like Armenia.
На той час Кам'янець на перехресті торгівельних шляхів, і що немаловажне,
In old times, Kamenets was on the crossroad of trade routes. It was well protected, so it gave feeling of protection and security. That was a right place for Armenians, craftsmen and merchants.
І отут вони якраз за цими мурами і знайшли гарне ото місто, яке дійсно насправді стало їх другою батьківщиною.
Probably that was the reason for Armenians to settle down here. They founded Annunciation Church back in the 13th century. Later in the 14th century, they built St. Nicholas Church with astonishing tower, which is the only one that is preserved.
Ми зараз знаходимося на території, де збереглися рештки фундаментів древнього вірменського храму.
We are on the territory with the remains of the foundation of the St. Nicholas Church, which was the main Armenian church here for ages.
Храм зведений ще в кінці 14 століття, в 1398 році, на кошти багато.
It was built up in the end of the 14th century, in 1398, and sponsored by the rich Armenian Sinan Kotlub.
Році на честь Святого Миколая храму в місті Кам'янці-Подільському. На жаль, цей храм, який
Unfortunately, this temple, which suffered a lot from fire, was kept by Turks in the end of the 17th century, was ultimately destroyed by the Soviet atheists in the 1930s.
атеїстами під час становлення радянської влади.
Lithuanian princes and Polish kings granted privileges to Armenians. Armenian community in Podolia consisted of 300 to 1,000 families.
З Криму, не західно.
In Armenian part of the city, the square was formed, and it was called in the 14th century the Armenian market. Later on, it was called Nicholas or Cathedral Square. By 16th century, there were Armenian schools, cathedrals, hospitals in Kamenetsk. Those were the first stone buildings, because previously buildings were made of wood. Armenian masons transferred to the local population their century-long experience of working with stone.
На каждом шагу в Каменец-Подольском можно
We can see Armenian influence in Kamenets-Podolsky architecture everywhere. So this is characteristic style of work with stones Armenians brought with themselves. Kamenets-Podolsky was also called the second Echmiadzin. Many Armenians lived at the outskirts of the city. So it was a joke that if a rooster starts singing in Kamenets, he can be heard in 3 different states, in Austro-Hungary, in Romania, and in the Russian Empire. Kamenets population consisted of 3 communities, depicted on the shield of arms of the city, Polish, Ukrainian, and Armenian. If threatened, they were facing enemy as a single front. In daily routine, each community lived autonomously, with its autonomy, self-government, and even judiciary. Armenians in Podolia were not only equal to others, but sometimes had privileges. They were eligible to take positions both in the Armenian community and in the entire city. Polish kings always enjoyed privilege, but the Armenians were also paying them back.
Вірменські купці надавали послуги самому королю.
Armenian merchants lended money to the kings, helped to buy treasures, traveled to Persia and other countries in search of their treasures. In modern terms, they were well connected and they were rich people. Although they lived a relatively close life, Armenian community made its contribution into Kamenets life. A well nearby magistrate is still called Armenian. The matter is that water was in short supply in Kamenets. People had to transport it from the river. But one rich Armenian dug well on its expense and presented it to the city. In 1672, Turks ruled Kamenets for over 28 years. Many Armenians whose ancestors earlier retreated from Turks from Ani and Crimea now had to flee to Lviv, Zamość, Stanislav, Warsaw, Krakow. Their houses were again burned, temples were destroyed, their shrines were taken to the other churches. Miraculous icon of the Armenian Virgin of Kamenetsk-Podolsky is currently in the Catholic Cathedral. It is still decorated with golden and silver parts and decorations. Another Armenian relics, the icon of the Armenian Virgin, is now located on the territory of the Moscow Patriarchy. Sad eyes of the Virgin and Armenian Khachkars point out to the tragic destiny of the Armenians, who could not avoid Turkish pursuit even in Podolia. History unfolds according to its own rules. Generation changes after generation. New generation made a tradition to visit after a wedding ruins of old Armenian church. After Armenian community lost its right for self-government in the end of the 18th century, most Armenians moved to Catholicism and assimilated in Polish environment. If you walk down the streets of our town, you will see definitely black-eyed girls with characteristic Armenian features. So gradually Armenians assimilated with the local population. But family names Aslanovich, Abramovich, Martirosovich are still here. But sometimes people have no idea of their Armenian origin. History of Armenians in Bukovina is long enough. Back in the 14th century, Armenian churches are mentioned in the letter of Catholicos Theodorus II. Bukovina is on the crossroad of important trade routes. Trade route from east split in Chernovtsi, to Kamenetsk in the north, and further on to Poland in the west. Chernivtsi became the second most important center for Armenian diaspora in Romania after Suceava.
прихід вірмен в Чернівці.
Arrival of Armenians to Chernivtsi had to do with construction of buildings of stone, opening of trade houses, and so on. Armenian historian Sadok Baronch links first stamps of the diaspora with the family of Ayvazov, father and two sons.
Айвазів. Це батько і два сини.
They started trade here. Later on, Armenians from Galicia and Moldova moved to here.
Століття почали масово переселятися вірмени з Галичини з одного боку і з Молдови, з Сучави з іншого боку.
So religious community in Chernivtsi was the center of Armenian life since 1833.
Час, як вважалась вірменська колонія, саме центром родинного і національного єднання на Буковині, в Чернівцях, була релігійна громада, яка була заснована в 1833 році.
So first Armenian priest appeared here with an icon of St. George in 1836 in the Lutheran castle.
Спеціально вивішена ікона святого Григорія, і вірмени коло тої ікони, ну, бодай би, хоч вона нагадувала про вірменське коріння, проводили богослужіння.
Օրհնյալ Տեր Հիսուս Քրիստոս ամեն հայր մեր որ հերգինս է սուրբ եղեցյան քո եկեսա տերություն քո եղեցին կամ քո որպես հերգինս եւ երգրի ըսած մեր հանապազոր.
In Botoshani in Bukovina was born well-known Romanian poet Mihai Eminescu, Michael Eminovich. First city theater was founded by Jakob Mikuli. His son Karol later became a student of Chopin and a founder of Lviv Conservatory.
Відомим вірменином був Якоб фон Петрович, перший бургомістр Чернівців. По нинішньому це перший мер, коли Чернівці отримали...
Jakob von Petrovich became the first mayor of Chernivtsi after the city received the right to municipal self-government. His family was very rich.
Свого часу він успадкував рицарський титул, тому і от його син протягом 2 років був отцем міста. Так було прийнято після нього називати всіх бургомістрів.
Cathedral in Chernivtsi was the center of the Armenian community. Leaders of the community spent huge amounts of money for education. Children of Bukovina, Armenians studied in Vienna, Warsaw, Bucharest universities. Unfortunately, Soviet power destroyed almost all archives about Armenians in Bukovina, as well as about Jews or Poles.
На жаль, ми маємо констатувати, що з приходом
Unfortunately, we have to state that after the Soviet power came in 1944, vast majority of archives relevant to Armenian life were destroyed. Personally, in my family, we destroyed almost all photo albums.
які збирав роками мій дід і мій прадід. Так сталося з багатьма вірменськими родинами.
In the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th centuries, a big number of Armenians from Galicia moved to Bukovina, Pokutta district.
Тут ще перехрещувалися торгові шляхи, бо тут була Буковина, яка була під владою Туреччини, а на цій стороні...
So there were trade routes here. Bukovina was under Turkey. Right behind Cherimosh River there was Poland, Austro-Hungary. In Kuti conducted several big fairs a year.
Заснували Кути. Їх, як били там турки, бо це мама розказувала, їм дали таку власть, той король, що прийняв їх, дав таку власть.
Armenians established Kuti. All nations live together, Ukrainians, Poles. There are always many mixed marriages among them.
Жінка, мама вірменка, дуже багато є цих.
Kuti village, Ivano-Frankivsk region, was even called the second Armenian capital of Poland after Lviv. Here, as well as in Berezhany, Snyatin, Horodenka, Zhvanets, Yazhlovets, hundreds of Armenian families lived. Nowadays, only old cemeteries, called by the local Polish cemeteries, give a hint to this. Descendants of the Armenians who are buried here are now all scattered all over the world. They all had to leave after the 1939 annexing of northern Bukovina and Bessarabia to the USSR. Poland became the third motherland for Armenians, who earlier migrated to Crimea and western Ukraine. Poles always were friendly to Armenians. In Warsaw, Bogosiewicz family settled. The same family which we saw on Banilev Cemetery.
Армяне были приглашены przez polskich królów, tak? Они не так просто не только сами приехали. Король знал, что если он хочет, чтобы государство лучше делало, лучше развивалось, надо пригласить армян, потому что они умные люди.
Armenians were all invited by Polish king. King knew that if he wanted to give boost to state development, it was worth while inviting Armenians. So Armenians were very clever people, and Armenians worked very hard for Poland. They never betrayed. Both Mr. Maciej and his wife Marta Aksentievich remember stories of people who fled to Poland from Western Ukraine and Bukovina in order to avoid Soviet Stalinist regime. What is interesting is that my grandfather is Armenian, my grandmother is Polish. When my grandfather died, all information about our family we received from grandmother. It was so nice how she did this. She said that we have to feel ourselves intelligent because we are Armenians, and Armenians are great people. And we did feel ourselves as great people.
Она об этом говорила, она говорила, что надо, чтобы мы чувствовали себя очень думны, что у нас такие корни, что армяне это великие люди, это аристократия польская раньше была. Ну и так мы себя чувствовали. У нас такой был священник.
So we had once a priest, Kazimierz Filipiak. He was the last Armenian priest, ordinated by Archbishop Teodorovich. He was Polish from Lviv, but he felt himself as Armenian. He used to say that Armenians in Poland are just like the Polish, to be twice.
Pamiętaj, polski Ormianin to 2 razy jak Polak. I my tak говорили.
There is an Armenian community in every big Polish city. Bogosiewicz family, together with other families, visit liturgy every Sunday. Armenian Catholic priests conduct service in 2 languages. Perhaps the faces of these parishioners would not be very similar to the faces of Armenians, but their ancestors once left Ani, the old capital, and their parents were born in Galicia and Podolia and escaped to Poland. Stalinist regime did not spare those who stayed in the USSR. They were all named White Poles, and they were all sent to Siberia in wagons for cattle. Baniliv inhabitants and people from Pokutia recall Armenians as wealthy and very educated people. Yevgen Nemets, local museum director, showed us the old cemetery. The Armenian cathedral in Kutin currently belongs to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Maybe this is the only reason for the church to exist. But there are no signs of Armenians in the cathedral. Only elderly people can remember something about Armenians. Prior to the Second World War, some 2,000 Armenians lived in Kute. Now we managed to find only 2. Zakhary Agapsovich is also a Kuti inhabitant, but since Soviet times, his nationality in the passport was written as Ukrainian. Antonia Lazarevich is among the last Armenians in the village. How would you identify yourself? You are an Armenian or you are a Ukrainian? I feel like Armenian, though I do not speak the language, but it is like a big family of mine. Zhvanets village is right on the border of Khmelnytsk and Chernivtsi regions. As in many other villages of Podolia and Bukovina, Armenians are used to make up to 1/3 of its population. There is an Armenian church in the village. Historians claim that in 1766, people found asylum behind the walls of the church against Turkish attack. Generations change, but Earth persists. Everything returns to normal. As memories about great people of this land return. And there is no way to explain this except of providence. Joseph Teodorovich was the Archbishop of Armenian Apostolic Catholic Church of Poland. This is the way destiny works. The Poles see the descent of Ani Armenians to his last trip. Poland pays tribute to him with representatives of its highest religious and state power. But the last burial service is conducted in Armenian language. And the prayer for the dying sounded on native to him language that sounded around his lullaby. As it is sounded around lullabies of dozens of generations of Armenians who found their second native land far and away from Mother Armenia. People who left priceless heritage to Europe are grateful to them.
You